millennial industrial complex. Can you talk about the string of hit pieces on Fetterman for using closed captions in the interview? Really dishonest framing. This is good. Very, very...
Thank you for the segue.
Yes, an excellent segue. One thing you can always bet on is establishment media lining up to disparage left progressive figures in every way they can. Well, it's just, fair and balanced. Let's talk about that because we have a clip. We do have a clip. Bradley's going to pull this up. So John Fetterman, the polls have gotten a little bit tighter between him and Dr. Oz. And part of this has been because I think Media Matters did an analysis that Fox's primetime lineup mentioned Fetterman more than any of the other Democratic Senate candidates across the country. They've decided that they're going to attack him on crime, attack him on being tatted up. Tucker Carlson said he was, quote, brain damaged and could barely speak. So they're using his stroke against him, even though he's been pretty transparent about the about his path after having the stroke. And there was actually a piece in the New Yorker that goes really deep into it, or it's actually, New York Magazine, written called The Vulnerability of John Fetterman, but it's really a positive piece. And it's
Rebecca Traister,
written by Rebecca Traister. I'll read you an excerpt from that in a second. But just take a look at how this was framed in this NBC interview, where John Fetterman sat down with an NBC reporter who's
Dasha Burns is
Dasha Burns
and Lester Holt intro. This is kind of the going into it where Lester Holt talks to her a little bit beforehand, and then they go into some excerpts, and that I think is one of the more clarifying interactions too, even before the interview itself. Right,
and basically Fetterman had to use some transcription software so he could be clear about what she was saying, and this is how they choose to frame that interview and lead it off.
Another pivotal Senate race in Pennsylvania, now considered a toss-up. Our Dasha Burns spoke with Democrat John Fetterman in his first in-person sit-down interview since he suffered a stroke. And Dasha, this was not a typical candidate interview.
No, Lester, because of his stroke, Fetterman's campaign required closed captioning technology for this interview to essentially read our questions as we asked them. And Lester, in small talk before the interview, without captioning, it wasn't clear he was understanding our conversation. Can voters trust that you will be able to do this job on day one?
Yeah, of course.
This is Pennsylvania Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman's first in-person sit-down interview since a stroke sidelined him from the campaign trail for months.
That auditory processing where I'll hear someone speaking, but sometimes I'll be able to be precise on what exactly that they're saying. I use captioning.
His campaign required that he be allowed to use a transcription program on his computer during our interview.
I always thought I was pretty empathetic, emphatic. I think I was very, empathetic. That's an example of the stroke, empathetic. Yeah. I always thought I was very empathetic.
So this is really disgusting because he was open and transparent about his, and they're clear about it, right? In the small talk before, it wasn't clear he understood what I was saying. Yeah, he's having some gaps in his thought right now. That's why he used the damn transcription technology. It's ableist, and I don't often point that out, but the framing of this is gross.
And let me just say a few things about the framing here as well, in terms of both Dasha Burns saying that she anecdotally in her small talk with him, she didn't seem like he was understanding her without closed captioning. Kara Swisher of Sway, the Sway podcast for the New York Times, I think that's still where she is, as well as Molly Young-Fast, another podcaster and liberal commentator. Both had Fetterman on their shows recently and testified to the effect on Twitter that neither of them had this problem. So it seems a little bit disingenuous to highlight this when two other people had long-form conversations with him and did not report this from happening. I'm not saying it doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but two other people had long conversations with him and did not indicate that this was an issue. And then the other thing that really bothers me is saying that is the question surrounding whether he's fit to serve. I wonder if she's asked Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen this, or New Mexico Senator Ben Ray Lujan, who had a stroke earlier this year and is still serving his constituents. I think it's pretty unfair to say because you have a cognitive impairment, that's not actually leading to any lack of cognition. It's a lack of being able to find a word or being able to say a sentence clearly without having taking a few words to clarify the actual word that you're saying. I think that's really not fair to then basically translate that into being he is unfit to serve because he sometimes gets his word scrambled because, again, he had a stroke.
It is. I mean, I didn't even know about those strokes. You know why? Because there wasn't an NBC News report on it in which the reporter anecdotally goes, it wasn't clear that Ben Ray Lujan understood what I was saying.
Understanding my small talk.
I thought you were a reporter. If it wasn't clear, then why the hell are you reporting it? You maybe should have tried to figure that out. And even if not, I mean, yes, he has to use transcription software right now. And would this be an issue if John Fetterman were deaf? Would this be an issue if John Fetterman were blind? Would you be highlighting that at the beginning of your piece? There are people who have auditory processing issues who need to use transcription software. Does that bar them from holding a Senate seat? Because that is the undertone of the piece. And as you said, Bradley, right? There have been other reporters who've said this is crazy. I mean, he needs maybe some assistance at this point, but that he was clear in our conversations, and this is backed up in this New York Magazine piece that I mentioned earlier. Here, I'm just going to read from it. Lack of transparency about a health condition would be unsettling, except that there has been ample coverage of Fetterman's AFib, cardiomyopathy, thrombectomy, pacemaker, defibrillator, weight loss, and auditory processing difficulties. His campaign also disclosed that he'd taken 2 neurocognitive tests, which both of which, it said, fell into the normal range. Every week since he reemerged, Fetterman's public engagement has increased, and nothing about his increasingly frequent rallies and media interactions appear to be at odds with what doctors suggest would be normal for a 53-year-old 4 months out from a serious stroke and expected to make a recovery. There's no great mystery about whether or how well Fetterman can speak. You can watch him do so regularly on television. There is also no open question about whether he can quickly process what he hears. He cannot do that well yet, which is why he requires closed captioning for interviews and the upcoming debate. At one point, when we were talking about his work to address crime and gun violence, while Mayor of Braddock, Fetterman said what sounded like a nonsense word, which is quite similar to what happened in that interview there, which they chose to open in the first minute of the segment on. To have actual dominated, he paused, dominated, he paused again, getting frustrated. Yeah, he added with a small smile. This is the stroke right here. Then he took a breath. Documented, he said. Documented. Our 50-minute conversation, in which I could see his eyes moving swiftly across his computer screen as he read and responded to my questions in real time, included moments like the above, where it was clear that Fetterman's vexation amplified his communicative challenges. Then he would relax and speak easily and without hesitation until the next expressive bump came. Yet legitimate newspapers are pushing for further documentation with some of the energy once applied to Hillary's emails, while the right-wing carnival barkers treat complete medical records as they did Obama's birth certificate. The latter have taken cues from the Oz campaign, which in August sent out a doctored image of an overweight, shirtless Fetterman, splayed with the messages Fetterman is a fraud, and John Fetterman hasn't attended a public event since May 12th, the day before his stroke. And, quote, text lazy to 26771 to depict the Democrat as a weak, shiftless liar. So, yes, he has been transparent. This is the way that you frame somebody who's recovering from a stroke. This is on the timeline that doctors say is quite normal for the stroke that he suffered from. And there's really no issue here, right? The issue is, what does he stand for? John Fetterman has been an advocate for abortion rights for his entire career. Fetterman has had the ear of union leaders and has been a pro-labor mayor and politician as lieutenant governor within the state of Pennsylvania. You can go on, but these questions don't come about, and we joke about Herschel Walker a little bit because he's a clown and we don't know if he's has a medical issue when he's saying nonsense. No, we know there's transparency and documentation about what John Fetterman is saying, and he's speaking with clarity, even if he stumbles over the occasional word.
And can I just say, for some testimony here from not even just liberal or commentators or left-leaning commentators, Liz Mayer, who, by the way, I cannot stand. She's been a flack for some of the biggest losers in Republican politics, for British politicians as well. She is not a credible source on basically anything, but even Liz Mayer in this tweet from yesterday said, folks are saying this was a rough interview for Fetterman, but I'll be honest, and I say this as someone who cannot stand the guy. He sounds as lucid as Herschel Walker did months ago, with no stroke, no pressure over abortion allegations to throw him off. And Kara Swisher, who did the interview that I was referring to, said, sorry to say, but I talked to John Fetterman for over an hour without stop or any aids, and this is just nonsense. Maybe this reporter is just bad at small talk. And this is someone who had a stroke about a decade ago, Kara Swisher, that she wrote about or later in this Twitter thread. I say this a lot of times just in general about how inhospitable and cruel this world is to able-bodied people, and that I can't imagine what it's like for disabled people of any capacity, physical, mental, emotional. This is a prime example of it right here. This is the so-called standard, one of the so-called standard bearers of objective and impartial journalism, basically telling somebody, because you sometimes speak kind of funny, you can't be an elected official. Or you shouldn't be. Or why should you be? It's really, really disgusting, and I don't think this level of scrutiny has been applied to other politicians, and I don't think it's a fair level of scrutiny, because why aren't we talking about what Fetterman actually believes? Why aren't we talking what he would actually do as a senator?
Yeah, I mean, should we play any more of this, or?
Oh, if you want.
Yeah, just a little bit more.
Emphatic. I think I was very, empathetic. That's an example of the stroke, empathetic. I always thought I was very empathetic before having a stroke. But now, after having that stroke, I really understand, much more kind of the challenges that Americans have day in and day out.
So you say you're on the road to full recovery.
Jesus.
But right now, voters really have to take your word for it. We've asked for your medical records. We've asked to have a conversation with someone from your medical team, to interview your physician. You've declined those requests. Why?
Well, I feel like we have been very transparent in a lot of different ways. When our doctor has already given a letter saying that I'm able to serve and to be running.
I mean, respectfully, that letter from your physician, that was 6 months ago. Don't voters deserve to know your status now?
Being in front of thousands and thousands of people and having interviews and getting around all across Pennsylvania, that gives everybody and the voters decide, if they think that it's really the issue.
Polls show Fetterman's lead is
Yeah. So great. I'm glad she followed up 3 or 4 times on that question.
Yeah. Thanks for saying respectfully, Dasha Burns.
That it's like saying no offense.
No offense, but that was 6 months ago, and you sound like you have a disability. So what's going on there?
Yeah,
it's basically
can we either hurry this up?
Wrap it up.
Or
are you reading fast enough?
Yeah.
Are you reading your closed captioning fast enough? Like, what's indistinguishable besides the tone of voice and the decorum than what Dr. Oz says about Fetterman in his campaign ads and speeches and stuff?
And here, no offense to Dr. Oz, but I would rather a scarecrow with barely any kind of sentience be in office than this idiot, as long as that scarecrow stood for abortion rights, for healthcare improvements, and I believe I'm not even sure, Fetterman at least supports universal healthcare broadly, but being a pro-labor senator, I would be in favor of a dog being a senator over Dr. Oz, who at the very least would vote the right way if he had the right people around him. I don't care. So it doesn't matter to me whatsoever. I hope it doesn't matter to the voters of Pennsylvania, but who knows? I mean, the fact that these polls are tightening is quite concerning. And just a reminder, Dr. Oz stood in front of a Nazi car at a fundraiser recently and killed dogs for experiments. So speaking of dogs, the dog would be much better than Dr. Oz. The dog would put Dr. Oz in prison.
Bark.
Yeah.
Lock her up. Lock him up.
The dog Senator Dog seeks reparations for the treatment of his brothers and sisters by putting Dr. Oz in prison.
That would actually be really awesome if a dog, like, you know how in some of these, like, there's been like public interest stories about like a dog in like a town of like 25 people in Minnesota is like mayor of the town.
Yeah.
And if like there was like something like that in Pennsylvania, just like started running against Oz, like purely on that platform.
Right.
Like he killed like many of like my brothers and sisters. And Dr. Oz was like, well, I don't know what to say to that.
I mean, this is slanderous.
This is slanderous. I mean, the dog shouldn't be saying this about me. It's a dog.
Rick B., as a disabled person activist and someone who works with the Disabled People's Organization at a high strategic level, working with local and national government and media, that is total disableist crap, and thanks for the strong pushback, Emma. Thank you, Rick B. Swim Shorts. It's the TV show-ification of American politics. His stroke has made him into a hard character to sell. It's part of the same disdain they have with Bernie and why they like their new Latina character when they can try to farm drama off of her. The JFK debate really changed everything. Good point.